KnockBack, the retro and nostalgia podcast, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support our show, go to patreon.com/laststandmedia. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to KnockBack. My name is Colin Moriarty. I'm joined as always by my brother, Dagan, Heavy Raider Moriarty. Dagan, thank you for joining me today. How are you? This is a false start. I accidentally didn't start recording the video, so we did like 15 seconds or so.
Yeah, we were just joking how we don't want to do this episode twice.
No.
Talk about Heavy Raider.
Whoa.
My goodness.
Whoa.
Kyle, I wanted to do something. I never get to introduce you. I never get to I never get to do the host thing. So,
sure.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce the bucket to my beast, Mr. Colin Moriarty. I think it's opposite. I'm probably the bucket to your beast, but I'm gonna call myself the Pegasus. You're the Galactica.
Oh, okay.
You're
the
new,
Pegasus.
sort of polished, more contemporary unit. You're the old fossil.
Right.
Capable.
Right.
But rusted out.
Right. I understand that.
That's not me.
So it's good to be here with you today, Dig. I appreciate that auspicious, declarative introduction for me, and I'm glad to be here with all of you out there. This week has been amongst the very busiest weeks I can remember. Just not really by any other, it's just kind of by happenstance. And it also happens to be so hot here. Oh. And as everyone knows, I've been talking about, I work out, get right into the show. So I'm always like sweating and wiping my face down as I'm like beginning the show. But I had this situation yesterday where we had to go to the bank because I owed money to the guys that are building our pool, and they've been here all week. So that's the whole part of this craziness, is that they just decided to just do everything now.
That's
this week. And I'm like thrilled because like they just got a ton of shit done over the last few days.
Right.
But so anyway, it just happened that I had a little bit of time. I had to go get a money order or like, a personal check, cashier's check, whatever you call it. And I worked out. Micah and I went. I've been taking cold showers after I work out to just like cool off my body after I work out.
Sure.
And then, so I go, I'm fine. We go to the bank. We drive 15 minutes, go to the bank. We come back. And then as I'm driving back, I start getting like really super overwhelmingly hot. And like, I look at my arms and it's just all beaded like sweat. And I start like feeling nauseous and shit. And I'm pretty hydrated. Well, hydrated. I just feel like my body, I don't think is really very, at this age, I don't know, like very well adjusting to this southern, and we're not even deep in the South, but this southern style humid heat, because I went to a warehouse, or not a warehouse, a house rather, that a friend of the show's owns. He's like a builder and he flips houses, and he had a bunch of games he wanted to give me. I gave a bunch of those games to you. I actually went primarily to get those games for you, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But
it's awesome.
When I was there, he's like, always out in this. He's always doing his thing. The guy's like it's probably like 100 degrees, right?
Oh,
like,
I'm sure humidity. It is there. It has to be.
And there's no AC on in this house or whatever. He's totally pristine. Totally fine. I am literally sweating like a whore in church in this place. Dude, I literally I'm like crouching down on the floor going over games, and the sweat is just dripping on like every game as I go through it. And I feel like crazy because this guy is just standing there like totally like moving boxes and he's totally fine. And I got back in the car and I'm like drenched because I sweat a lot when I work out too. I guess I'm learning that I am a sweater as I get older. And it's weird because I do everything I can to maximize comfort, and yet I can't get a hang on this thing. So that's why I have a towel in my shirt right now, because it's just cooling me off.
That's why you're looking particularly perky this morning.
Yeah, you were saying I look
this afternoon.
Got some tater tots out for display. Now, Dig, I wanted to ask you about the games. Are you happy with the bundle? I was so, we're not going to get into any specifics, but you've been dealing with some things in your life lately, and we've just been talking to each other a lot.
Sure.
And I feel really connected to you right now. Well, I always do, but especially now, I know you need me, and you keep saying I'm very protective of you, and it's true and all of that. And I knew there was something I could do for you, and I was trying to figure out what I could do. And then this thing kind of fell in my lap where this guy, nice guy, reached out. I was like, I have a bunch of games, and I'm like, I think I know exactly who would like those games.
See.
And so we went through. I picked out everything that I thought you would want. We bundled it up, boxed it to you. And so, is it like a nice treasure trove for you? I know it's nothing like mind bending, but it's stuff that you needed, right?
Oh, absolutely. It worked out so cool. Yeah. I mean, you've been, it's so nice. I was thinking about this, like, lately things have been a little tougher than normal, kind of personal things going on and stuff. But it's so nice when you have a family that, you think is close and you think everybody loves each other, but then the rallying around when the going gets tough, when it gets a little thick is really nice to see. It's like the proof in the pudding of what you always suspect, but when it's actually happening, it's proof positive that you really have a good family. And yeah, you've been great through all this. And the lot of games has been awesome. Now, you got me a sampling of a few different things. First of all, I got a Sega CD console, which I never owned before. Grew up playing that with PJ a lot, and thought I would sneakily slide onto eBay and grab a copy of Snatcher, Hideo Kojima's early outing, very rare for the Sega CD, $1,800. So I'm not going to be getting Snatcher. I thought it was a few hundred, but I didn't know it was that high. But the nice thing about the lot you got a little sampling of SNES carts in there, some Genesis stuff I didn't have. The bulk of it is NES, and oddly enough, even though they're not super rare titles, there's a lot of them, and for some reason I just didn't have many of these games. A couple of Tengen games in there, a couple of like things like Jeopardy, Rad Racer 2, like things that are a little offbeat, but certainly not uncommon necessarily, but really rounded out my collection. It looks good. I have to send you some pictures. I did everything yesterday. I sort of rearranged my shelves with the new NES stuff, especially coming in. And it's looking good over there, man. I have to say, it's looking really nice.
Yeah, we should get a little tour when we can of your space. And yeah, I was happy to do it. And it was because I'm just flipping the rest of these, as I've said, for G.I. Joes. And so that's really exciting. And I'm like so into just like I'm talking to people on the DL. Like I see a person, like just a random person, like that I follow. I follow these random people that like collect G.I. Joes, and I DM with some of them. I'm like, don't even bother with eBay. I'll buy what you want. And there's this one dude that has like a mega collection, including the flag. And I was like, the flag isn't necessarily very rare, but it is the gold standard of G.I. Joe collecting. Absolutely. And I've seen some people turn them into coffee tables. And I think that's like what I'm going to do.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
What a great idea.
Yeah. Like, because I was trying to tell Micah, I'm like, you have to understand that this thing is like more than 6 feet long.
It's ridiculous.
And it's made to put the G.I. Joe planes on it.
Yeah.
Like many of them.
We used to walk on it on time. I know we talked about that in the G.I. Joe episodes. Like, in order to get in and out of Tommy's room when we were playing with that, we used to have to step on it to get it. And it was totally fine. I mean, we were little. We were, 10 years old or whatever. But yeah, that's big even by coffee table standards, that toy. Oh, dude, that would be amazing. Amazing. So
my mind, because I was like, that was not even a piece I was really worried about. And then I'm like, oh, if it's available, and the guy's like putting some stuff together for me. And he had like a bunch of like random accessories. I love that shit. I'm like, I just want accessories, weapons, backpacks. Like I like putting that stuff together. Oh, and like then finding the loose figures and then completing it with a bunch of different batches of shit I buy. It's fun.
It's so nice to see you, so into that. You got to immerse yourself in a hobby like that. It's essential. It's essential. You got to do it.
I agree. And for me, so I'm glad to give you those games, and glad they brought some joy to you. And you should look up, if you haven't, Hideo Kojima has been talking recently about some experiences of his early on in development, and he talks about Snatcher and Metal Gear before that, and how he would like apparently go to like game stores in Japan, like local game stores, and like hand out flyers for his games and try to sell them that way. And then he bought 3 copies of Snatcher on his own, I think, to like boost the sales.
That's amazing. Can you imagine?
Yeah,
that's so cool. That's what all the veteran video game developers need to do. They need to delve back and talk about like my early days at Capcom or my early days at Konami or whatever. Like that's the stuff I want to hear about. Me too. Those beginnings.
Me too.
Me too. So fun.
And so it's funny you brought up Snatcher, and we'll see if we can get you a copy of that at some point. I know that's a game you really want.
So good. So inspired by classic sci-fi and cyberpunk Blade Runner. I mean, Blade Runner is all over that game. I've been watching like cinematics and Let's Plays of the game. It's so funny. Like, I don't know how I missed it in the beginning, because I feel like we played even the really offbeat Sega CD games, PJ and I. For some reason, that one just wasn't on our radar. But yeah, dude, I'm pretty, how I feel about Kojima. So
yeah, no, of course. And so I also just want to give you a passing compliment on your Smith shirt. That's a great shirt.
Thank you. Very late comer, kind of a Smith's poser. I mean, I was talking about this with Helene. We were joking around like 6 months ago. Like, probably started really listening to them like a year ago.
Interesting. Well, it's a very...
late than never.
it's no, I agree. I didn't get into them until college, and it's a very emotive sort of rock. I think it's the kind of rock that really bowls you over, and you can't just. I don't think you casually listen to the Smiths. I mean, that's why I don't listen to them very often, because it just brings you places. That guitar, that
totally
like, oh, it's just
the sound.
And just that. Oh, it's beautiful and depressing. So I like the Smiths a lot. But we got to give a shout out to Allie, of course, because she's been a long time fan.
Yeah, long time Smiths and Morrissey fan. Just don't go on. I made the mistake of looking at Morrissey and just outside of the music and just his personality and things he says and stuff.
He's pretty right wing. He's a pretty
divisive dude.
Yeah, he's very right wing.
Like, and he's very demonstrative. I mean, he's got a big mouth. I mean, he's very outspoken, I guess I should say. And I never really knew that before. So sometimes it's like, even no matter what the politics were, I don't really want to know. Sometimes you just don't really want to know. You just want to delve into the art,
I totally agree.
So that's for me anyway.
I totally agree with that. I don't take too much umbrage with him, just because it's so weird to see anyone saying, he says some divisive things, but also some things that I don't know everything that he said, but just some right wing things where you're like, oh, that's kind of mainstream right wing, but you just don't hear, the singer of the Smiths.
No, you don't see that
saying that. That's why I kind of appreciate J.K. Rowling and some of these other guys that are just like, fuck it. I mean, J.K. Rowling's in like complete fuck it mode at this point, which I totally appreciate. All right, Dave, let's get into the topic at hand. It's a meaty topic, as we suggested. It's Battlestar Season 2, 20 episodes. And we were going to do Razor, I think, for this one as well, maybe. But I think what we'll do is we'll do Razor separately. And maybe we'll even do there's like a mini series or a web series in between seasons 2 and 3 as well. Maybe we'll fold that all into an episode before we get into season 3. I don't know. But for now, let's worry about these 20 episodes. I'm curious what you think. You said something to me over text that I thought was really interesting, that you said Battlestar Season 2 at some point, this is when the show went from good to very good. That's what you felt. And I'm curious to just hear your kind of high ranking thoughts, or 40,000 foot thoughts about what you think of the season.
Yeah, I mean that for starters really sums it up. I think the series went from good to probably about halfway through this season to thinking, okay, this is very good, very well written, very well realized, great world building, really nice evolution of the characters. I think probably going in, I have to say, very intimidating topic, just season 2, very big, 20 episodes, about 49 to 50 minutes each one. And I tried to strategically, I don't usually do this. I'm usually pretty thought out and I try to stay ahead of things, but I tried to watch them relatively recently. I think I only watched them all over the last couple of weeks, just so I could kind of be fresh and not lose too much in the old man memory banks. And also, I have to say, as much as I like the series and I can't wait to get into it with you, a couple of things. One, I know how much you love this series and how much it means to you, so it's really kind of a pleasure doing it because I know how much you enjoy talking about this. And you're the one who turned me on to it. 2, you've seen the whole thing, you've seen the whole body of work, but I'm only, just to remind all you guys, I'm only through season 2 right now, so I haven't spoiled, I'm not ahead of that, so I can only kind of articulate and converse based on what I've seen so far. So I just know that going in, I don't know beyond the ending of season 2. And if I may proffer up just a little bit of criticism going in. One thing occurred to me in the series it sort of occurred to me through, going through, but at the end, I sort of arrived at these thoughts. It's a very mercilessly heavy show. Very, very melodramatic with not a lot of levity. I think it speaks to the flavor of sci-fi that I'm sort of drawn to. I like fun. I don't mind the drama. I don't mind the gravity. I like a nice storytelling, great characters. Seriousness is fine. But like the best sort of episodic fiction that we know, we always talk about the Mad Men and Sopranos specifically. I know those are gold standard. But they're great examples of, not holding back on the drama, melodrama, seriousness. I mean, look at Don Draper's situation, right? But they strategically inject sort of absurdity, humor, maybe even going, like I think about the lawnmower scene in Mad Men, right?
Oh, man, yeah.
Just brilliant, speaks to reality, and also breaks up that sort of, the seriousness, which starts to feel it starts to feel stressful when you're watching stuff like that. It also speaks to a little bit of, and I know the creators come out of Star Trek, but it also speaks to Star Trek a little bit for me. Like either it gets overly technical or overly bogged down in sort of just being nerdy or serious. And I think you need a little more of that levity. I can't think of that many instances of levity over this entire season. So for me, that's really the only thing it really needs to be, I think, up there. You know, especially season 2, to be up there with the Mad Men and Breaking Bad, Sopranos, all of the, you know, The Wire,
Thrones,
all the great
etc.
stuff that we've gotten over the past couple of decades.
Right.
So that was really the only, you know, sort of mile high overarching criticism that I have for the series. But I mean, there's a lot to say. There's a lot to break down, a lot of story points, very well thought out, lots of characters. So I really can't wait to get into it with you. I mean, probably some of the greatest character building I've seen from one season to the next. Very pleasant experience with that. And, you know, I came out of season 1 feeling differently about quite a few of the characters when we talk about wrapping up season 2. So there was that evolution for me too, of like really being drawn to some characters that I thought were sort of being, I thought they weren't being well used. You know, I thought they could have done a better job with certain characters, and they seem to address that in season 2, which I think is really cool. Some of those characters that I thought were squandered in season 1. So I can't wait to get into it with you. We have a lot to talk about, 20 episodes, a lot of characters coming in and out.
Yep.
Which we could talk about, a lot of new characters.
Yeah.
So
I think
fun.
it's funny because this season to me, I think I got to go back and look, and I really haven't read about the production of Battlestar in a long time, but I feel like it was either in the second half of season 2, because this season was, for people that don't know, the one half of this season happened in 2005. The next half of this season happened over in early 2006, and it was when seasons started getting split up. And I think it was the second half where people started criticizing, I think into the third season, that Sci-Fi wanted more one-off episodes that don't really speak to the plot, but get into the characters, and didn't feel like people missed something by not watching the serialized nature of it. I don't know that we've gotten to that fully yet. But it's interesting to me to hear your criticism, because I kind of agree in the sense, I've always loved this show, but I understand that it's not Game of Thrones. It's not it's definitely not Mad Men. And it is under that. It even in production and thoughtfulness and stuff, it's not Breaking Bad, which I am not a huge fan of, but certainly am much more fond of after we did our recent 3-episode knockback about it. But it's funny because what you find so nerve-wracking or stressful about the show and watching shows like this is exactly why I like shows like this. And it reminds me a lot of the conversation, and I don't know if you've heard anything about it, but the show Ozark on Netflix, which I'm a huge fan of. And
that's the Jason Bateman show?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm only through the first 2 seasons of that.
Yeah. So you're familiar with it then?
Yeah.
That show is brutal in terms of just no levity really at all, and just gets darker and darker as Jason Bateman gets, you know, more and more in. And it's a show that's really tense. Like, people have a hard time watching that show because it's
I
like
can see that.
And I like it with Battlestar because, if anything, my criticism is somewhat different, where I feel like it's not serious enough sometimes. I feel like it doesn't.
Oh, that's interesting.
I feel like this situation, everything in the show tries to ground itself somehow. The science is trying to be grounded, and, you know, FTL drives is not really grounded science, but it's one way that they can figure out how to move ships. It's the same thing like they do in Star Trek, and Cylons and kind of robotics and AI and all of that. But I feel like this situation would be so dark that you could make it way worse than this. And you almost get a feeling of that when, and this is where I want to begin with Admiral Cain. When she is introduced, and I fucking knew you would love Admiral Cain. I couldn't wait for you to meet her. And I can't wait for us to watch Razor so you can see what they were up to before.
Oh, that's what it centers on?
Yeah.
Oh, that's going to be.
And as I told you, she mentions to her XO, it's just a reference. She says when she's trying to get loyal Marines, she's like, I want them loyal, Jack, razors. And it's a reference to things they did back when they basically murdered a bunch of people, took their ships, took all their
Super
supplies,
sick.
and left them for dead. So let's start here. And of course, on KnockBack, which is supported on Patreon, patreon.com/laststandmedia, we hear from the audience. You guys vote on topics, submit your questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, and ideas. And Michael Steinmetz wrote in and said, how tense was that Pegasus Galactica standoff?
My God.
So what did you think about the introduction of another ship, this whole group of people doing something else and integrating themselves, and actually, because of military protocol, they become the leaders for a little while, or at least Admiral Cain becomes the leader, and Commander Adama is, at her behest. So what did you think of all that?
I mean, it was a shock to me. I mean, first of all, this season, I love the way it delves into multi-part stories and then does one-off stories, all in the name of, like you said, speaking to the universe, the world building. It all makes sense. It's all useful. It all ties in. I love the way they kind of swung back and forth between those kind of one-off stories and the multi-parters. But this is really the meat of this season. And this, for me, this arc is where the season really started to get strong. I think it was funny. I was talking to you and texting with you as it was going on. I think my first thought, oddly enough, was like, okay, they're introducing something mystical or supernatural here. This is a ghost ship or something like that. So when everything panned out, spoilers, and it was a reality that this ship, there was another existing battleship that survived the conflict with the Cylons. It was really, really cool. Such a revelation. It sort of doubles the excitement in a way, because now you have a fleet with 2 warships basically. So it was super fun. And I loved, just in a broad strokes way, I loved the disparity between Cain's sort of battleship and her fleet and her sort of legion and Adama's, and the way that it's quickly realized that they're handling their conflict with the Cylons in completely different ways. It really makes Adama and the Battlestar and the initial, the Galactica and the initial fleet look like they're really handling the situation with kids' gloves, where Cain and her entourage are dealing with the situation with much more brutality. Just really brutality and, sort of a whole different approach to dealing with the Cylons. Both very believable, both actually kind of understandable. But I loved that sort of almost immediate conflict between Adama and Cain, and how that sort of played out with all the people, the officers, their sort of underlings, and how that kind of played out over a 3-part series. I was really sad to see Cain go. One thing this season does very interestingly is it gives us, maybe with the exception of one character, it gives us a lot of new, interesting characters, and then at some point, whether quickly or in a more drawn-out way, removes them, with, I think, the exception of the Anders character, is the only new character that makes it to the end of the season. All the other characters are introduced and then sort of plucked out, which is interesting.
It is.
I think, for the most part.
Yeah, I think that's done. I mean, I could be wrong, but it seems like they needed to introduce a second ship, and because the second ship becomes essential to the future of the story. And so I think they did it in a really interesting way by, again, taking advantage of, from my perspective, 9/11, post 9/11 ethos. Sure. This time, warrantless searches and holding people indefinitely and torture people and fascism. And that's what I said to you was Admiral Cain introduces fascism to the show, and it's been begging for it. And we mentioned last episode during season 1 that Adama could have made a fascist dictatorship, a military dictatorship, the second that this happened, and instead didn't do that. And he meets someone who did that and actually did it in the most brutal way possible. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up was, I love her XO Fisk. I think it's a great character. And he's really, his exposition, interestingly, comes from his conversations with Ty when they're getting drunk.
So good.
And I love that Ty basically is taking advantage of him. And because Ty is usually a punching bag, and maybe rightfully so, but he's actually pretty integral in extracting exactly what these people have been doing and alerting Adama, and through Adama, the president, as to the real danger of what's happening. And I love that they're getting drunk, and he basically says the first time, tells this horrible story about how the first XO was murdered because he wouldn't execute this crazy suicide run on a Cylon depot. And then at the end, he starts laughing awkwardly. And you realize that like he's slowly telling these people like Cain is someone to be feared. And I love the acting with Cain. I love in battle, she has this like really interesting way about her. She holds on to her console, and she has her own Mr. Gaida or whatever, and she's like, battle, she looks to the left like battle station, and she like seems to make very deliberate moves. She closes her eyes and like thinks for a minute and then just executes on the move. It's a very deft performance. And so what did you think about the way that they integrated Pegasus in that society, and how Adama overcame it? And it showed some darkness, especially from Laura Roslin, basically saying like, you need to assassinate this person.
Yeah.
It brought real darkness out and a little bit of fascistic inclinations on their own part. And Adama then tells Starbuck to do it, and Starbuck is willing to. So what did you think about their whole way of dealing with it? And I guess Cain's kind of heartless and methodical nature. She's almost Cylon-like in her approach.
Yeah, as you know, I mean, I love what you say about Cain. She's decisive in her lack of humanity. She's decisive in her brutality, and how, it flies in the face of really Adama's approach. And it really draws to your attention Adama's approach and how different those two approaches are. And the tension really mounts, of course. It's important to note that Commander Adama is outranked by Admiral Cain. So there's only so much he could do because of that military infrastructure that's still, that they're still beholden to. I love the point, first of all, of Fisk and Ty and sort of the exposition. I kind of got that after the episodes were done. I was like, yeah, they really used that to, sort of spell out what the Pegasus, how the Pegasus got to that point, how they survived, and how they basically just completely destroyed their own fleet. They had a fleet just like Galactica did, but they took it apart for the personnel and for the tech, for the parts. And basically destroyed and killed everybody else that weren't useful enough, that weren't A grade to them, whether it was equipment or people. So good. Besides just seeing how they interrogate, how they torture, how they rape the Cylons, just a completely different approach, and how that sort of animosity and how that conflict just quickly came into play, insofar as you said, wanting to, basically both commanders commanding their people to assassinate each other, which was really, you're like, what, you're really left to think like over the arc of those 3 episodes, like, wow, how is this going to possibly play out? There's no way these two different parties could get along. There's just no way. Their approach is too different. They're just way too dissimilar. So I really loved that. And, with Admiral Cain, I was sorry to see her go, but it really spelled out so much for, first of all, the Pegasus, it becomes part of the fleet, the Galactica's fleet. And of course, Adama is promoted via President Roslin to Admiral. So he goes from commander to Admiral now that he has more than one ship in his jurisdiction. But it's so, you're really rooting, you really like Cain. And even though she's so brutal, there is an understanding there. It's like, this is the Cylons are their enemy. There's not going to be, and, I love what you say about it really sort of spells out that 9/11 or post 9/11 period of the right versus the left, and how that's sort of, that's sort of supposed to be something.
Yeah, and Guantanamo Bay and,
right, exactly.
And all that as
whole
well.
Thing.
Yeah, I think,
it really, and a lot of the stuff that we'll talk about, really spells out stuff for, mirrors the real life things that it's speaking to. But yeah, Cain was really a treat, and Fisk, and everybody else we'll talk about later in a later episode, everybody else that came out of the Pegasus arc. And I love like little details, like how the Viper pilots under Cain were like hash marking their kills and stuff like that, and how there's such a disparity between the two approaches, and it makes you realize that, the initial fleet that we're following, the Galactica, the initial characters are really kind of doing it the right way with the most humanity. And it's not until you meet the other side that you realize that, that it really gets spelled out, that it really comes out in the wash. So it was really, that was really, really a lot of fun. I was really kind of sorry to see that they couldn't come to terms and that Cain didn't survive. I mean, I liked even Madam President, even Rosalind, sort of being the mediator between the two and sort of trying to broker some sort of peace. But you pretty quickly knew it wasn't going to be possible with these two. They were just too diametrically opposed in their approaches that, it wasn't gonna work out. But it makes me realize also like what could be in store for future seasons. Is this going to happen again? Where, I guess initially there was a battleship for every one of the colonies, right? So initially there were a dozen.
I think I don't
right?
I don't think there's more than that. How many? I think there's.
There was initially.
How many Battlestars were there? I'm looking it up in real time because I think they said it's like 70 or so, 120 Battlestars.
Oh, there's that many.
Yeah. So they built approximately 120 Battlestars.
Wow.
Yeah.
So there's only 2 left.
Yeah, and so
that's amazing.
Yeah. So and then there are obviously a bunch of other classes of ship as well.
Right.
I'm glad. Well, I didn't want to talk very much more about it, but I'm glad that you brought up Lieutenant Thorne, their interrogator. Interesting character, and yeah, they openly are raping and torturing this number 6, and it makes you wonder how much Cain knew and didn't. And he says, I think, and I have it written down here: "You can't rape a machine." That's the quote when they're almost flabbergasted that they would say anything at all to them. Like, what are you talking about? This isn't
right. Like, why are you protecting them? Type of thing.
And so, I like the idea of getting personnel, like civilian personnel, and how they go into that just a little bit, especially with Commander Adama on the deck with the chief that they get from another ship, who's basically a civilian engineer.
Yes.
Very interesting. They can tell just by the way he doesn't really know what's going on and all of that. I really liked that as well. We get more into that in Razor, and we can talk more about that then. That's why I don't want to get too much into it now. But needless to say, I think they had a fleet of 15 ships, and I agree with you that Cain is much more gray than she seems. The question just has to be asked. I mean, the torture and rape and all that aside, I mean, that's sinister no matter what. I think we can all agree. But in the main, her aggressiveness towards the Cylons, their attack, they're surprised Adama's surprised to learn that they are seeking out and attacking the Cylons, which the Cylons are not, and that they found the fleet because the Cylons have been following them, Adama's fleet. So they look weak when they're found because Cain is actually tracking the very Cylons and hitting them while they're chasing Adama. And so I think it puts them in a softer position, but it does bring up the question of like hot and cold. Like, you have to ask the question, is Cain's and her ship too much? Certainly. You also have to ask the question, and this does come up in the mixing of the two fleets and all of that, is like, is the other side too soft? Like, has the other side just been running and fleeing too much? And I think that raises a pretty interesting question. We hear a lot about a ship called the Scylla or whatever, where Cain apparently murdered a bunch of people that wouldn't come, like the families of all of the people that wouldn't come. It's pretty brutal. So but at the same time, she's so interesting. I said it to you, I love that she wears a sidearm. I think it's so cool. You don't see the officers on Galactica doing that. All of her officers do that. So it's just like a visual cue as well as to the way they kind of roll. And I want to ask you about this next. The thing I think is most interesting about Cain, and what I think is sad about her leaving so quickly, and there's other characters that I think are interesting that leave quickly as well, but she has a connection to Starbuck, and I really liked watching it flow out of their interactions with each other. They have these interesting correspondences that are very meta, where she's talking about like, don't hesitate. She's telling Starbuck, don't hesitate when she's on her secret mission. But Starbuck's thinking about it through the eyes of what Adama is telling her to do. And so it becomes this very meta and complicated situation where she actually does like Admiral Cain. And so I'm wondering what you think about their particular relationship. I liked that dynamic.
Oh yeah, it's awesome. I think, obviously Cain sees something in the younger Starbuck of herself, that maverick, more rebellious, maybe more a little more aggressive. I love what you said, the point about sort of the warlike nature and the aggressiveness, even down to the physicality. For instance, having guns where the officers on the Galactica didn't have guns, and also just not seeming to display any compassion for the Cylons, but also no sort of feeling of wanting to understand the science, wanting to understand their foe at all. Just an all-out, sort of, just a Cylon-like almost nature of just wanting to destroy their enemy in Cain and her troop, which is really interesting because it is ironic that, Cain and Adama, they're doing the same thing at its core. They're just fighting their enemy. They're looking for a way to survive. They're looking for a way to preserve humanity. And they're looking for a way to successfully win against their opponent, but doing it in much different ways. I love the thing with Kara, with Thrace sort of being sort of led to believe that she's going to be some sort of protege to Cain, or that she's being pulled from both sides. And you're wondering where it's going to land. Now, it turns out that Kara's loyalty is really down is to Adama, but there is some sort of relationship that's blossoming there between the two women. And it was really an interesting arc. It was also interesting to see that loyalty play out, where Kara was apparently going to assassinate Cain as much as she sort of liked her, understood her. If Adama wanted her to pull the trigger, then she, seemingly she would have. But I like the relationship. I love the fact that you could see maybe even in the Starbuck character that maybe she could become another Cain when she got a little older, if she kind of went through the Admiralty or the officership and got to that point, that she could be another one like that. You could understand Starbuck becoming someone of that nature. You could understand her leading in the way that Cain leads, which is different because she's kind of under the tutelage of Adama. So she has sort of both sides. I think it ended up being a great sort of arc over season 2 for the Starbuck character, and we'll talk about her more. But yeah, I loved seeing Cain's influence on everybody. Whether it was Adama, whether it was President Rosalind, Lee, Starbuck, her own, obviously we talked about Fisk, and, just sort of seeing how it seemed like they respected her, but a lot of them also, she seemed to be ruling from a place of fear. It's almost like a Bronx Tale, what's better to be loved or feared type of thing, whereas Adama is loved and she's feared. She's much more of a gangster than Adama is.
Certainly.
Super, super interesting character. I'm glad that we're going to get to see more of her in another, in that, that Razor thing, because now she plays in that too. Is it her proper, or is it a younger version of her?
Yeah, it's Michelle Forbes, and it's her, because it's not she's not very much younger. It's after the attack, so
great.
It's just kind of parallel, I think, to events in the show that we've already seen.
Okay.
Just from their perspective and what was happening with them. So yeah, we'll get into all of that. Another interesting thing that happens during the Cain arc is that we finally get some information about the Cylons, specifically that when they are too far from their home planet, that they cannot resurrect. And so they have this resurrection ship that is protected by base stars. And we finally get a little bit of what's going on with these guys as far as how they interact. And later on, we see both the number 6 and number 8 revive in a resurrection ship and how that all works. I'm wondering what you think about this particular aspect of it, and if it leaves you hungry to know even more, because there is so much more to learn about the Cylons, and you will. But they're finally, and I think the thing that they do really well in this show, maybe even a little too slowly for my taste, is they just peel the curtain back on the Cylons just very, very, very slowly, and actually give you much more information about the humanoid Cylons, which are inherently less interesting, I think, than the growing, like who's controlling them and who's their leadership and all that. We don't know anything about that yet. But what did you think about kind of getting a little bit more into the Cylons? Specifically, I'm curious about the resurrection ship and the destruction of it and making death permanent, and how that plays into the episode Scar, which is one of the great episodes, I think, in the season.
I love that episode.
So yeah, talk to me about all that.
I love the resurrection ship thing. I think it was really interesting. You're right. The Cylon sort of tech and explanation is very slowly teased out over the entirety of the show so far, but especially over season 2. We get more and more, but they are very specific, and they seem very methodical about what we know when we know it, and sort of, very thoughtfully pacing that out. the resurrection ship thing was interesting because, you know, it sort of turns out to be this on location ship for basically taking the Cylon on, you know, the Cylon consciousness and implanting it into a new body. So taking it from when a Cylon dies, taking that consciousness, putting it into a new body, that's the place where they do it. So along with the Raiders and along with the base stars, those could jump. They're part of a fleet. And on location, they could do this on the fly to create, I guess, new warriors, essentially, or new personnel, at least. Very, very interesting. And makes us, and, you know, just speaks to that sort of robotic production line, factory-like nature of the Cylons that it's interesting to me, like, during the course of the season, especially with the Sharon Boomer arc, that you're like, well, the Cylons sort of do show a lot of humanity, and there's a lot of things going on. There's a human Cylon sort of relationship that leads to the birth of the first, you know, human/Cylon child. And maybe these things are a little more human than they're giving credit for. But then you see something like this, which is like basically an intergalactic factory where they're created again. And it reminds you how robotic it really is and what the humans are dealing with. It's not, you know, the humans are wrestling with this thing of sort of surviving and not becoming endangered or extinct, where the Cylons are just created. So it really ramps up the danger and the tension for me because they could just create personnel on the fly. You know, it's how do you possibly fight this thing? You know, how do you, it seems almost, you know, it seems almost like why even bother? Because they're up against these enormous odds. So that was really cool. And I love also the thing with Kara in the stealth fighter in the Blackbird, you know, going on that mission to get those pics, to get, you know, to go behind enemy lines and get the pics of that resurrection ship. And that's where that whole mutual respect blossoms between Cain and Starbuck and all that kind of stuff. So that arc was really, really interesting. Also for, you know, just for Starbuck's fearlessness, you know, / craziness, whatever. But that was really, I mean, that was really cool. That was a really cool thing to see. Creepy. You know, we talked about the base stars being creepy, but those things are really creepy. The way they look, the way they're engineered, the way they're protected, everything about it was pretty cool. It was a pretty cool surprise to see that too.
We also see for the first time, although we'll see much more of this, I don't think we see it anymore in the season, but we see a Sharon model interface with a ship the way the human Cylons do. And
that was awesome.
And that there's something more to their human nature. Obviously, they're more cybernetic. And so, yeah, she shoves the cable into her arm or whatever, like cuts her arm open and shoves it in and jumps the ship, I think, that way. And it's like a blind jump they do. And it's very cool. I agree that we see a little bit more texture with the Cylons here. I think the resurrection ship is so interestingly symbolic because it adds the element of fear into the Cylons that they otherwise wouldn't have. We don't know how distant they are from their home planet. We don't even really know what their numbers are. And we're starting to learn towards the end of the season, obviously, that there is a division amongst them and a civil war even brewing amongst the Cylons about how they want to deal with the humans. So I love that at that point, once the resurrection ship is destroyed, the insertion of permanence just completely and utterly changes the game. And it feels good because the humans have won a significant victory. Now, every one of them they kill will not resurrect. Their conscience will, and their memories will beam out to nothing because they are too far and too distant from other places where they can be revived. So I loved that they got into that. It's jumping ahead, but I'm curious what you thought of watching them revive and the process of life and death and how clever I personally think it is that they bring in, because I remember wondering when I watched the miniseries, I'm like, what happens to the number 6 that died from the bomb when she protected Gaius? And I always assumed that at some point that's what happened. Gaius survived somehow. He has this consciousness. That 6 is with him, but it's interesting to think like she revived still in another body,
right?
And Valeri, when she was killed by Callie, dies and comes back. So what did you think about seeing those specific characters come back, and then the way it bends the arc of the Cylons away from this complete and total destruction of this idea that they need to annihilate all of them.
Yeah, it was really interesting. Probably the deepest part of season 2 for me in trying to just understand how it works, and also sort of the inherent humanity in it, where they kind of could come back, their subconscious or unconscious could be implanted into a new body, and how they sort of wrestle with that and have to kind of relearn. And it also seems there's something mysterious there too, where it seems like the different iterations are beholden to different personalities as well, which is very mysterious too. Like there could be a Sharon who's much more militaristic and bloodthirsty, and a Sharon who's much more compassionate for humanity too, which I'm maybe in the throes of still understanding that fully, but very interesting to me in that, you know, even though it's sort of this robotic thing where it's like you're basically, your mind or your being is going to be implanted into a new shell each time. It does seem to be different each time, even them getting used to their new bodies, even though their bodies are supposed to be complete and utter replicas of the past body, that they sort of take time to sort of ramp up and get used to and get acclimated to this new shell. Very, very interesting. There's a lot to think about there. Almost like that whole thing with Boomer on the planet, living in her apartment and listening to the loud music, and almost like a rebellious teenager or something. You know, it felt very strange to me. Like, okay, this almost seems to be acting out the way humans play out, you know, with the, you know, childhood and maybe the rebellious teenage years, and then blossoming into an adult, which I guess for Cylons would be a functioning Cylon agent, you know, and how it seems to be different for each of them too. I loved seeing the Cylons sort of coexisting on that planet where there was only, you know, there were so many people, but they were only the 12 or whatever, 8 so far we saw already, different models. That was really, really neat. But I love it, and I'm trying to fully understand it. And a lot of it is, I think that we just don't know everything yet, but it's very, very interesting to me. It makes me realize that there's a lot more to this than we understand by the end of season 2. But the growing understanding is definitely compelling me to want to learn more.
It raises the question of what is human. We talked about this earlier with the 6 being treated subhuman clearly on the Pegasus, and that, for instance, Valeri didn't know she was a Cylon. She really didn't. So when she is revived, she's like, "What the fuck?" You know, and she remembers a life that never happened. Really, it happened for a few years. She obviously was in love with Chief Tyrrell and all of the rest, but it brings in this humanity where it's like, wow, the Cylons. The reason that number 8, especially, I think that's her number, is so interesting is that, and number 6, I think, is a little bit less sympathetic, but still like this as well, is the very choices that the Cylons made have infuriated them, and because they were used, and while they keep calling them celebrities, one of them does point out that celebrity doesn't make any sense. We're basically a machine race, this not even communistic, but just this hive basically. And how dare we act like the only memories we have are either implanted in us, they didn't really happen, and you tricked us, and you had the audacity to revive us after we thought we were dead. And I love the way, again, that they deal with that, and about how, you know, when the resurrection ship is destroyed, there's a model that wants to be killed because they think they'll finally go into oblivion. And we talk about oblivion on the show sometimes. Cylons never feared that. We don't really know about the Centurions, but we know, for instance, that even the Raiders have resurrect and have brains. And this brings me into an episode I did want to talk about, and we brought it up earlier, which is Scar. I think this episode is incredibly interesting, not only because it lets us see the pilots being pilots. We get a really interesting version of Kat, and who I think is a really fascinating character, and kind of her coming out of her shell. She's always been loud and braggadocious, but now she's got nuggets underneath her, just like she was a nugget with hot dog and whatever when she came on. And I love this idea because we knew from the first season that the Centurions don't seem to have brains or any cybernetic or any biological function. But when Kara goes or tries to, I guess, leave the planet she crashes on and uses the Raider, she realizes that in the first season, she pulls out its brain. And so these things are alive and they too are dying and going back. And Boomer is the one that tells them, like, a ship like Scar is full of rage. He's died over and over again. Now his death is permanent, but they're still kind of trying to hit them. So what did you think about this episode? I thought it was maybe one of the best of the season.
Oh, dude, it was one of my favorites, especially for that one-off and sort of just going in one-off direction for 45, 50 minutes and just going and just exploring something that was fun. I love. But you reminded me in talking about, just before we get on to that, something that really compelled me and spoke to me in this season with the Cylons and just in trying to understand the enemy and trying to understand this thing that humanity is fighting against and everything. I loved, you made this point of that the whole Cylon thing. We know they're made by mankind, but the thing is so deep and so scientific, plus how much, the Cylons just sort of ran with how they were created and evolved in their own way. It's become so drastic that we actually see that there are certain Cylons who don't even realize that they're Cylons. On the flip side, we see the adverse sort of emotional effects on humanity that the same notion has on a character like Chief, who's actually paranoid that maybe he's a Cylon. So it kind of puts you there. It kind of makes you realize, wow, can you imagine the horror of this situation on both sides? That, the humanity, for instance, is being infiltrated secretly by these Cylons, that you would go to bed at night thinking like, holy shit, am I a Cylon? Like that's where it gets like, oh shit, for me. Like that's really great writing, and it really crosses over into horror in a way for me too, and so you see both sides sort of wrestling with that, with those sort of metaphysical questions. But for the Scar episode, yeah, man, first of all, broad strokes, I love seeing like a story centered around the Cylon sort of Red Baron, right? Their ace pilot. That's just fun. And that's something that reminds me, we never got, for instance, in like the mainstream Star Wars universe, we never really got something centered around like a badass TIE fighter pilot. So that's really cool. And also thinking about, even with that, it would be interesting in a different way. But now we're thinking about, we're dealing with robots, man-made creations. So what makes this Red Baron character, this Scar character, so much better of a pilot than the other Cylons, for instance, when they're all robots? It speaks to, again, sort of how much humanity is imparted in these things. And like you said, getting a proper vehicle for the character of Kat, who really didn't count prior to this. And why I love that is it really gives Starbuck a proper adversary, a proper rival, not just in skill, but in bravado. I think that over the arc of season 2, Starbuck is she's very interesting. They really take a lot of risks with the Starbuck character, I think, because, we compared her to Han Solo in season 1. And no matter what Han Solo does, whether it's part Harrison Ford or part of the writing or just that the fact that he's so charming and, so charismatic, that he's always likable. Even when he's being unlikable, he's likable. But the Thrace character could be really repugnant at times and really off-putting. And I think it's really interesting to make a protagonist that unlikable. And she is for, really until the end of this season. I would say she kind of ebbs and flows and moves in and out of being pretty gross at certain times. Very human. She's imparted with a lot of humanity, a lot of gray. But I like giving her a proper rival because we find out that Apollo, for instance, Lee, is so different that they're not really rivals. How, not just in skill, but in leadership and their humanity and their personalities. But I thought this was a really fun vehicle to have, a proper rival for the Starbuck character and Kat. And also kind of to explore the Cylons a little bit and how it works. And like you said, see things from the perspective of the pilots. I think, the Vipers are one of my favorite things. We talked about that in season 1. And I don't think, we talk about fun, we talk about adventure, we talk about that flavor of sci-fi, the dogfighting. There's not enough of it. There's just not enough of it, especially in season 2. So it was nice for them to move back in towards the end. You're like, when are we going to see some Vipers? 5 or 6 episodes before the end, we get that. And it was a lot of fun. It was super cool.
Yeah, I'm pleased that you brought up Starbuck is a challenging character. I was saying to Micah, because she's watching it for the first time with me, I'm like, I actually like this character a lot more than I did watching it this time. I think I appreciate and respect this character a lot more, and where she comes from and how daring and bold and brave she is. And yeah, I think it's cool to have like a protagonist that's kind of on the edge. We don't often get that. Sometimes we do.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah.
Dig, I want to bring in the audience here again. And I want to talk about, before we got to have the audience.
Come on.
Hugo Ribeiro wrote in us and said, I wanted my girlfriend to experience BSG since I loved it when it originally aired. So we just watched it together this year and she loved it. As I was rewatching the episodes, I got even more amazed when the interactions between Gaius Baltar and Number 6 happened. They're just so good. That music sets the tone for the scenes perfectly, giving them a sense of mystery and conspiracy. The chemistry between the two is awesome, and to me, those scenes just showed how great of an actor James Callis is. When Gaius was talking with other characters and then 6 appeared and started to conspire and seduce him, to me, those were some of my favorite moments. Just great. So thank you for writing in, Hugo. We went into this a little bit last time, but I feel like they really ratcheted up in this season, and I got to give it up. I mean, I feel like it's easy. Obviously, Gaius is a villain, but I like James Callis's performance, and I think Tricia Helfer is really good. I know you went into this on the last season, but she has more acting chops than I think almost anyone on the show, maybe outside of, Edward James Olmos and Mary McDonnell. I mean, she's certainly on that level, and I'm wondering what you think about the evolution of Gaius in Number 6 here, and I'm fascinated by Gaius's arc. I think I wrote down in my notes, but I'd have to read it to the exact extent, but he saves Laura's life and removes himself from having power immediately in order to exact it later on. And I think it's kind of a clever thing, and he does it. We still don't really know what the function of this Number 6 is even in his life. And obviously she disappears for a little while when he starts to become enamored with the tortured 6 model from the Pegasus. So what did you think about those two characters? Because we often only see them together. And I agree with Hugo. I love watching Tricia Helfer walk into a scene where it's just fun, like seeing, because you think about it from the actress's point of view and the actor's point of view, like she's on the set with all of these people and they have to pretend she's not there. And sometimes she's put into these scenes where you never see her with one of these people. And I loved that. Like there's a scene, just as an example, we're not going to get into this, but there's a scene where Rosalind and Coddle are talking in her office. And I was like, this is so interesting. Like these characters never interact here. They interact elsewhere. So anyway,
true. Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about 6 and a little bit about her relationship with Gaius and how that evolves throughout the season.
Yeah. I mean, one of the biggest mysteries, you're always trying to kind of define it and get straight with it and understand it. First of all, yeah, James Callis is Gaius. He's awesome. He's one of the characters that, really leaves you guessing which side he's going to land on. Very compelling. And he really did have a great arc. You see that sort of Gaius/6 interaction sort of propelled forward in this season. And, 6 being the ultimate manipulator, and the way she dresses and the way she talks to him and trying to get under his skin and trying to, bend him to her will, apparently, and all that. And him trying to resist until he really can't, and he's always won over. But it seemed like what really this sort of met a really interesting point for me in season 2 was when Gaius does save Madam President. He does save Rosalind with the sort of Cylon human embryo, the fetus, taking the blood, and then he finds out in the petri dish that it eliminates the cancer cells and everything. He does save her. And afterwards feels vastly undervalued and underappreciated. Just when it seemed like he was maybe swinging towards the side of good. And that's what repels him in the other direction. So, again, speaking to the nature of the series, it's very understandable why he flies off in the other direction. Because Rosalind does sort of treat him badly afterwards. She's very, she really sort of seems to be taking him for granted. And that's what sort of propels him to want to pursue the president. That's one of the things that seems to want to pursue, he's drawn into the presidency himself and to race against her for the position, which I thought was really interesting. I thought that was a really interesting way to take the character, because he's not he's not a person of substance, maybe like Rosalind is, but he's going to do it for his own reasons. He does it in the face of saying that he's against the whole anti-abortion thing, but really it's for his own, it's serving his own self-centered nature, really, apparently, or at least for one of the reasons, besides, I guess, Six getting under his skin and sort of moving him in that direction as well. But yeah, man, I mean, Tricia Helfer, knowing that she didn't really do a lot besides modeling, she didn't do a lot of acting prior to the series. Like, she's really, really good. I would never have known that. She's great. She's really, and Exceptional Challenge should be doing the different iterations of the Six character as well, which we get to see. We're kind of treated to during season 2 as well, which was a lot of fun. That's not an easy task. And then seeing towards the end of the season, I guess, towards the end of the season, seeing the iteration, sort of seeing the roles reversed and sort of a fantasy Gaius haunting the one iteration of the Six character. That was interesting. So now it gets turned around, which I thought was really a lot of fun. That was a great way to take it. And for me, leaving even more question marks. It's like, all right, now how is that working? So lots to find out in season 3. Unfortunately, I hear negative things about season 3 and season 4, but I got to find out for myself.
Yeah, season 3 I think is the least popular, and I think it gets better. I mean, I don't think I've seen really season 3 and 4 in a while, so I'm excited to get into it in the coming weeks as we get up to that point. But I think one of the interesting components about this season 2 to me was just kind of the discussion, which we hear in the first season too, but this idea of love, and that the Cylons, there's at least Cylon human models that feel like that is the missing component. And I think why they're so obsessed with Hera, the to be born half, or, at some point is born half human, half Cylon, with no blood type and all the rest, and basically the savior of the president herself. I wonder what you think about this notion of love and this notion of almost cross-racial in this world love, where Six thinks she loves Gaius, when she does love Gaius, I guess. Gaius loves Six, and the Chief and Hilo love Sharon, and none of it really makes much sense. It almost, like, we often think, in other words, of love as like a uniquely human thing, and it is, but there's this other group of conscious beings that are trying to grapple with what it means and if they can do it. And it brings them to the point of wondering if the entire genocidal revenge mission that they went on was just a massive error. And it's almost quaint when they talk about it, because it's like, are you kidding? It's done. Like, you did it. It's done. Like, going back. In fact, we hear from Dana Beers, who we'll talk about in a little while, that the attack went so well because of number 6 manipulating Gaius, that it's even their wildest and best projections didn't see them succeeding this well. So what do you think about this component of love and this mystery around it this season?
It speaks to me of some of the best sci-fi I've seen. And you think about space opera, right, which Battlestar is one of the emblematic space operas. You got to have the love. Got to have the love triangle, and sort of redefining love between aliens. In this case, a lot of things like Macross, for instance, they explore love between humanity and alien races. In this case, it's humanity and a robotic race. But it is interesting because it seems to be saying, or you could read into it, that if something is human enough, if it has enough human-like qualities or human-like potential, then humanity could love that thing, and vice versa, which is really interesting. Not to even speak of also the complication of the love triangle, which is a big thing in space opera in general, but Battlestar Galactica specifically. If you think about, D, Lee, Starbuck, D, Lee, Billy, Six, Gaius, whoever else, everything. There seems to be love triangles that play everywhere you look. And that complicates things as well. Hilo, Chief, and Sharon. There's so much of that going on, and it is a compelling thing, especially because it seems. It speaks to something real too. I think if Cylons were real, if we could think of modern 2021, whatever, here on Earth, Virginia, Pennsylvania, anywhere on the planet, there were Cylons here, and they displayed the humanity that Cylons do in the show, I think you would have that. I think you could see that, they're human on the surface, emotionally, not only physically, but emotionally, mentally, their thought processes, everything, so it's a really compelling sort of, and one of the major parts of the show, that they anchor a lot of the story on. And I think that speaks to, a big part of the reality of the show. And one of those things that kind of makes you think for yourself, like, yeah, that's a compelling thing. And it takes it out of sci-fi and just makes it grounded and realistic. It's interesting to me too, Kyle, like they do this half human, half Cylon baby character, knowing that it's possible now. What are they going to do with that, in the series, now that we know it's possible, now that we know what's happened, the sort of horrific nature of the whole thing of pretending the baby died and then taking it away because you're afraid what the Cylons are going to do in pursuit of that, baby. And, the nature of the humans sort of wanting to fight by number and saying, okay, like if we're going to stand a chance in this conflict, in this world, we have to outlaw abortion. No human child can be killed. Everyone is valuable. We have to bolster our numbers, basically. So there's so much, that centers around that question of love. And, loyalty is certainly a big theme in the show, too. And it's interesting to me. It's interesting it's going to be interesting for me to see, all the information I'm given now, it seems to me that the Cylons and the humans could probably get along if they could just put their differences aside. It seems to be that much humanity at play with the Cylons. And really, what are they really not knowing what the Cylons are after specifically? Like, why this overwhelming notion of just wanting to destroy humanity? Why? How come? And especially when you see that the humans could be compassionate. And, again, that plays back into the Cain thing again, where it was like a part of humanity wasn't. They had the same idea as you. They wanted to wipe out their enemy, point blank. That's it. No questions asked. So there's just so much. I mean, how many seasons are there in total? 4 or 5?
4. It's 4.
There's 4. Okay. So we're halfway through.
Yeah, there's not quite, because the first season I think is a little truncated, but yeah, almost, because it's 20. I think it's like 10, 20, 20, 20 or something like that, right? So
okay, so it's
like
20. There's 40 more episodes,
right? And
gotcha.
There's a lot more to go over. You brought this up, so I am interested to just talk about it now. In relation to this, what do you think about this? Can you hold on a second, Dave? So, Dig, you asked about, or you talked about this in our conversation with Love about the Cylon's mission, and it came to me, even though they have a plan, in quotes, that such a genocidal plan seems to have no purpose and is almost, it speaks to the robotic nature of the Cylons inherently. This is a plan that seems to have come out of, at least from our perspective, a machine, right? Like a computer simulation. And it's just like war games, like win or lose. We can get our numbers together and go back and execute these people, basically. And we know that there's much more ethereal and religious components to this as well. We learn that the Cylons won't kill themselves, for instance. And we hear more about the fact that they are indeed monotheistic, which is a far cry from the polytheism that runs through the colonist society. What do you think the humans, I guess, should do in this situation? Because we see it from Cain and Adama. Cain is attacking, Adama's kind of running. I just wonder, like, what you think the solution would be. We see at the end, and we could talk about it, that the Cylons basically subjugate the humans and are kind of in control of them, in at least some of them now, on the surface of this planet that they found. And I wonder what you think the Cylon's goal really is, and how the humans should fight back. Because my personal opinion, and I know it's easy to say, it's always easy to say in these situations. We always say it in the real world too, right? Like when a bunch of Syrians started flowing into Europe because of the Syrian civil war, it's easy to say, like, I would stay and fight, but I didn't have, my entire city destroyed and have nothing left at all. So I'm not going to necessarily judge that. My stance here, though, with that bravado in mind, is there's no way I would subjugate myself to the Cylons. I would have a much more Anders-like philosophy of like, I'm probably going to die and I'm going to take out as many of these things as possible. So how would you react, you think, in this situation? And what do you think the Cylon's goal is? They clearly do have one, but now it's diverging.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You put yourself in that Admiral's chair, right? It's like, I could understand if we're just breaking it down to Adama's approach and Cain's approach. I can understand both approaches. To me, first of all, the Cylons are so utterly mysterious. Humanity doesn't really know that much. They know that they created the Cylons. They know the Cylons came back empowered and they destroyed most of humanity and they're on the run. It seems like humankind doesn't know a lot. So the approach of running while you try to learn more makes sense in that regard. In other words, not to confront your enemy head on in this case, because you really don't know fully at least what you're dealing with. So running while you try to gain some sort of understanding makes sense. It also has a lot of inherent danger in that, because while you're running, you could be utterly destroyed, right? If you're not fighting back, then you're not creating any obstacle for your enemy, and there's an inherent danger in that. Whereas Cain sort of fighting brutality head on with brutality seems reckless in a way, because there's no way Cain's, sort of fleet or Cain's officers, Cain's, the crew she's commanding could understand that much more than the Galacticas. So she just chooses to keep the enemy on their toes, with force. Cain, I think it's also important to say the Pegasus is a lot stronger than the Galactica. It's a more contemporary ship. It has more firepower. I don't know how much larger it is, but Cain commands a better fighting force than the Galactica does. So there's also that important dichotomy to note. So you're kind of sympathetic to both approaches. Maybe the best approach, given the knowledge that we have coming out of season 2, is to sort of do, we know where it ends. Obviously, it doesn't end on a great note for humanity, but maybe the best approach would have been to sort of take both approaches, run, gain some sort of understanding when you can, refuel, reload, and then attack when you can. And they do, like you said, they scored a big hit. They scored a big win with destroying the resurrection ship, for instance. But so you see humanity sort of take a couple of battles, but it seems like they're still fighting this evasive front where they're mostly running. And it is interesting to me what the Cylons want. It's like, again, they're such a mysterious entity. It does almost seem like, if you're asking me coming out of season 2, it does almost seem to still be beholden to some sort of religious belief. Something that they believe, that the enemy is humankind and they need to be destroyed. That whether it's that they believe humankind is evil or, that they're a blight on the universe, there's some sort of virus, whatever it is, they seem to be compelled to destroy humanity, no questions asked. There seems to be blips on the radar of certain Cylons, but it seems like the majority of the Cylons still believe that the humans are the enemy and that they need to be destroyed. It's those little pockets, it's those little exceptions on both sides that are probably the most interesting to me at this point. Those Cylons that are sort of having second thoughts, and the humans that are the Cylon sympathizers. We see little pockets of humans that, are sympathetic to the Cylon cause. That's interesting to me, and again, very very realistic to me. And you could also see, of course, all the plays, if you think of like 2005, 2006 era planet Earth. There's a lot of mirroring of what's going on in real life compared to what's going on in outer space with the Cylons versus humanity. Certainly.
You had brought up Anders earlier, and I talked about him in passing. We should go back and discuss this as well, because
sure.
the season kind of does begin with this. I don't think it's the most interesting arc, but I think it's really cool. We find that there's this this team of pro sports players that in a game called Pyramid that has been holding out, and I really love that. I think that's fucking hysterical, actually. I think that is a really cool thing. They're basically in the mountains training when this all goes down, so the Cylons don't know they're there. So it's literally this complete professional sports team. And Kara kind of ingratiates herself into this group after realizing that they're kind of conducting these, terroristic hit and run I mean, in a good way. I think it's good terrorism since they're fighting the oppressor, but in the science fiction world, of course. But we see a little bit of the humanity here too, when we see Starbuck truly fall for someone in Anders. What do you think about that whole route? I felt like when I was watching it, I thought a lot about you with Anders, because I feel like you would have liked the whole pyramid angle. I not the game itself. We see them play it a little bit, but just this very clever idea of this sports team kind of fighting as a resistance band. Seems like something that you and I would enjoy.
Yeah, it was cool. It was a great idea. I love sort of starting the season off, taking a break from outer space, not with just the pocket of, Chief and Crashdown sort of fighting against, sort of a hold up on that planet after crashing there. But this whole thing with these athletes turned militia forming this pocket of resistance down on Caprica and opposing, the Cylon contingent on that planet was really cool. Reminded me a lot of, they're holed up, they're in the woods, they're in the mountains or whatever. But God, my mind is going blank for a second. The zombie series.
Oh, Walking Dead.
It reminded me so much of The Walking Dead, where they're holed up. The people are holed up in the prison in that world. They're holed up in this high school, this abandoned high school that they're using as their facility to sort of live and to give them shelter and give them a place to stay while they're fighting these Cylons. It was really interesting, and also to see Starbuck enter into a relationship that seems to go past the sex. Starbuck gets involved. She's a little bit of a loose cannon. She gets involved with this one. She has this relationship with Lee, but it seems very surface level for her to fall for this Anders character. And you could see that, she's fallen in love with this guy and promises to come back and rescue them. And he wants her to stay, but she says, she feels compelled to get back to her people, get back to the Galactica, but says, I'm going to come back. And they go quite a lot of episodes and never really get back there until to the end of the season. But it was really fun. It was fun to see a little pocket of resistance fighting the Cylons sort of down on the surface of this planet and doing the best they can. And it leads to a lot of other arcs. It leads to, of course, Starbuck getting injured and getting captured by the Cylons, and the whole arc with her being in the hospital with the reproductive experiments and everything, the Simon character. Super, super fun stuff. I think this season gave us a lot. It gave us a lot of variety, and it gave us a lot of the Starbuck character too. Plenty to chew on with that character.
Certainly. Did you think when she left that we would see Anders again?
You know what? I wasn't sure about that. I thought it would be a little reckless to just leave that character there. I wasn't sure. I have to say, I really wasn't sure. And I really, you're almost not even sure that Starbuck really feels the way she does about that character, because we haven't really seen that from her. She loves to drink. She loves to gamble. She just has sex with dudes. Like, she has a very typically machismo, like that usually you would see this, especially in fiction, from a male character. That's what's so interesting about her character. She had, you rarely see a female character like this in fiction. Where she's very much, the playgirl, I should say, in this case.
Definitely.
So you're not even sure she's convinced. So it was nice to kind of bring that home, and for the Anders character to survive, and for them to be holed up on the planet when they are invaded by the Cylons at the very end, that cliffhanger that we get at season 2. But yeah, I wasn't sure at the time. I really wasn't sure where they were going to go with that.
Let's bring in some of these new characters. You would have brought up Simon, which we don't see too much of, but Austin wrote in and said, "Hi guys, I really love how season 2 introduces a couple of new and interesting Cylons we had not seen before. The original cast is amazing, but adding more depth to it and further fleshing out the villains with characters like Brother Cavill and Deanna Beers is really interesting. I think it also does a great job of building to the epic finale of season 2. What do you think of the new characters the season introduces, and how they change the dynamic of the show?" So it's interesting to see Lucy Lawless pop up, right? I remember the first time watching this, I'm like, oh, it's Lucy. Xena is a Cylon, so that's fun. But I like her episode being introduced and doing that kind of raw documentary about the Galactica, and then I love seeing her at the end in the movie theater when you realize like she is a Cylon.
Didn't see that coming.
Yeah, I remember not seeing that coming either. And then of course, Brother Cavill, I think it's a little more telegraphed as being a Cylon when he starts talking to Chief, but I love that character. I think that character is bonkers good.
Yeah,
And
really cool.
I do love how the Cylons were wise enough to seemingly create a series of humanoid models that are very different from each other and have persistent personalities, gruffness or humor or sadness or levity or sexiness or whatever. So what did you think of some of these new characters?
Again, really is interesting. And now the Lucy Lawless character too. What does she play? Number 8? Is it number 8?
I gotta look. Yeah, I think maybe I'm getting the numbers wrong. Yeah, I'll
Whatever
look it up.
Cylon she is. She is another one that makes it to the end of the season. So I shouldn't say it was just Anders, but for the most part, all the new characters that we're introduced to are just, they're just kind of fly by night. We don't get to hold on to them by the end of season 2. The Simon character, the doctor in the hospital, I remember, you're really rooting for Starbuck at that point. She falls under fire. She's shot. She's captured. You don't know at the time, but she's captured apparently by the Cylons, and then she wakes up in that hospital to this benevolent doctor, soft-spoken, easygoing, seems very comforting. I remember really like, please, Simon, be a good guy type of thing. Turns out he's a Cylon, and she's in some sort of Cylon, facility where they're doing these human Cylon reproductive experiments, and they're gonna basically experiment on her, and she gets wind of that cleverly and manages to escape, which is cool. But then, with her, the Lucy Lawless character, the journalist / filmmaker I was really fooled by that arc, because here you think it's just this troublemaking human, maybe, what would apparently be a left winger in that universe, right? And you think she's out to make the Admiralty and, the officers and the Battlestar and the commanders look bad. And you think she's going to make a film that casts them in a negative light. And she ends up making this film, which is actually sort of realistic and, casts them in a positive light. And you're like, all right, cool. But it turns out in all of that she's a Cylon. And the whole thing was like, there was all this other subversion going on. So that was really cool. And of course, we talked about Cain and her officers and how, that one thing we didn't note, I think we forgot to mention during the whole Cain arc, is that Chief and Hilo are captured and ordered to be killed because in rescuing Sharon from being tortured and raped, they beat the guy, but they inadvertently murdered the officer who's carrying that out. And they're ordered to be killed. And that's a whole nother thing in the arc that Adama finds himself tasked with, is like, they're not, this fellow officer or this admiral who ranks above me is not going to kill my men, 2 of my officers. So that was another really interesting thing. But it's so funny to see all the players. Who's the actor who plays the current commander of the Pegasus in episode 17? Episode 17.
Oh, yeah. Let me look. The Captain's Hand. That's John Hurd.
He's great.
Yeah, he's a great actor.
They really do a great job of casting in this show. People that really, again, like, don't see the B movie side of sci-fi, that take the role seriously and really lend to, they add to the success of the series. They add to the believability. They add to the writing. They take it to the next level. They really make it good. Nobody just phones it in. No, there's nobody that phoned in a performance, whether it was a bit player or, a major player.
It's awesome to see John. I was gonna say, it's just awesome to see John Hurd pop up, because of course he's the dad.
Dude,
he's the dad in Home Alone.
How great was he in that?
Yeah.
Immediately you buy him in the role, which is really cool. Then the other thing they do too, and they seem to be structuring arcs around this, you get to see more of characters like Billy. You get to see more of characters like Gata. You get to see more of characters like D. They sort of blend them in and make, they rise them up, at least in an episodic fashion. They'll come to the forefront, and you'll get a little more about these other people rather than just Adama and Starbuck and Apollo and Madam President. You get some texture to, and Gaius and, Six. You get some more of the other players that didn't rise to prominence in the first season. So that was something cool that they did in season 2 that seemed to be, part of the trajectory of, world building and character building. And that was cool. That was cool to see. I especially liked seeing D get up there and, her relationship, her sort of sudden relationship, physical relationship romance, whatever you want to call it, with Lee seemed a little forced, or sudden. But I guess, that was part of the thing, was like, let's see if we could get Dee in here a little bit. Let's see if we could kind of rise her to the forefront for a bit, which I like. You might as well not, they're great characters. You might as well kind of use them.
Yeah, totally. And per the Garner character, I wish they spent a little more time with him as well, just because it was fun for the first time to be exposed to another part of the ship that we don't really see. There are just certain components of the ship that we never really get exposed to. We see the Marines a little bit, but we don't really know about their structure or who leads them necessarily and who's who amongst them. I do like that we see them in plain clothes on at the bar in the in Cloud 1 or whatever they call that, or Cloud 9, whatever they call that ship. Yeah, and that was really cool. But I like that John Hurd's character is referencing kind of the engineers and the people in the pits, like keeping everything going. And I love the symbol of the watch that he always held, about how everything was like always regimented, and he was used to, as Lee says, working with machines when he's promoted to commander of that ship. What did you think about that exposure? It is his fault that the ship gets attacked. He falls for an obvious Cylon trap. I don't know what he was thinking, but I love the heroism of him going in and fixing the problem himself, understanding and diagnosing the problem. It's not quite as dramatic or sad as seeing Cain go, but it was like, why can't this character just stick around for a little while longer?
I know, just give us a little bit more of this cat. Well, I love that whole thing, because that was one of the episodes that really subverted my expectations, because you have this character, he's a lead engineer promoted to commander of that ship, of the Pegasus. And he's sort of out of his league because what he knows is tech. He doesn't know people. He doesn't know strategy. You think that, when Lee's like, at that point, he's promoted to major, and he and Starbuck are both on the same page, like, no, this is a Cylon trap. And the commander's like, going against their sort of advice and saying, no, I disagree with you. He's not doing it because he's a coward. He's doing it because that's what he really thinks, but he doesn't really know military. He doesn't have any military jurisdiction or knowledge or, knowledge of strategy like they do. And you're thinking this guy's a coward. And then what you see him do at the end, he's able to delve into his area of expertise in order to save them. And he turns out to be a hero, which was, I thought, a really clever bit of writing. You never see things that are that thoughtful, where it's just a character who thought he was doing the right thing in one way. He was just out of his area of comfort, out of his area of jurisdiction. And he ends up being a hero in his own right, which I thought was really cool. I thought that was really, really thoughtful. And that sort of thoughtful storytelling and that sort of thoughtful writing really it compels us to see more of that character, but they're also very clever about telling a great story and then getting that character out of the way, almost like it would be an impediment on what's important. And I think that takes a sort of amount of courage too, especially when you see a successful bit of acting like that. You must look at that and be like, all right, we could do a lot with this character. Like this, even off the page, from the page to the performance, like this is even better than we anticipated. And you could see them being tempted to carry on something with that character, or maybe make something more for that character than they initially thought they would. So to actually brush that character aside and concentrate on what the trajectory you initially intended is, that takes a sort of amount of courage, and commitment, which is cool.
Sure. Something else you had brought up earlier was, and we kind of glossed over it was when Starbuck is in the hospital and is basically being experimented on, and there's that really creepy conversation with Simon when he's basically saying like that they need to reproduce and stuff. What do you think about the obsession with the Cylons have with reproduction? It seems like they're trying to will themselves into existence and they can't seem to do it. And you would wonder if they would why not just embrace the fact that you can just create more of yourself or more models or whatever. What do you think of that baby farm and people being plugged into these machines, and they're just the Cylons can't seem to figure it out?
It's super interesting because it makes you think like, okay, the Cylons, they know they have this technology which seems advanced to humanity, right? It's like they could just, take, they have this immortality where it's like the body is a shell, They basically take the subconscious, put it in a new, that body expires or is murdered or is killed in some way, passes away, and then they could take that and put it in a new body. So essentially they never die. So you think they would be content with that sort of technology, but it seems like they're thinking like either we could take our race to the next level or even make a better Cylon. You know, what if we kind of cohabitate with people, with humankind? Like, is that a possibility for us? So it seems like they're thinking about that. Like, could they make even like the next echelon or even more superior race of Cylon by coexisting with people, which is creepy. And they're sort of forcing it. And it also kind of makes you realize for how advanced they seem that they have questions too. That they, you know, maybe they're just as fascinated in humans being their creators as humans are fascinated in Cylons. And maybe, you know, humans thinking Cylons are so advanced, maybe Cylons kind of think that of humans in a way too. I think Dr. Cottle even says in one way, like they could have done this any way they wanted. The reproductive system is exactly like humans. Why would they do that with all its inherent faults, you know? So there's something about that too, where they almost put human physiology on like a pedestal, where they don't even, it seems like they wouldn't have to do that. They can make it even better, which is interesting. So maybe the Cylons don't know as much as we think they know, or, you know, they don't know as much as man thinks they would know, given that there's this, you know, quote unquote superior race, or have even gotten better than man intended. You know, they've somehow managed a way, even though they're robots, they managed their own evolution in a way too, but maybe that doesn't mean much. You know, they still have they still have questions just like people do, which is interesting.
By the way, I had forgotten to answer the question for you and for the audience before about the model number. So I do have that list.
Oh, yeah.
So Cavill is number 1. Leoben is number 2. Deanna Beers is number 3. Simon is number 4. Doral is number 5. We know number 6. And then number 8 is Sharon. And there are others. We haven't learned.
We haven't learned them all yet. Okay.
So I wanted to ask you about this too, about the idea of conflicting goals. And this all comes to a confluence actually at the end of this season. Simon Pusateri wrote into us and said, "Hey, C&D, I wanted to write in to see how each of you felt about the ending of this season. For me, the time jump and then occupation by the Cylons was an absolute jaw dropper. I remember being so shocked the first time I watched it years ago and feeling like I couldn't wait to start watching season 3. Keep up the good work. It is surprising, and we'll talk about what you think is going to happen, because I'm curious about that. I have a few what-if questions for you. I know the answers to, but I'm curious, as someone who's kind of caught in time right now, what you think about things. But before we get to that, what do you think about the conflicting... I mean, Gaius represents this in the election, obviously, and what do you think about the conflict between finding Earth or just settling? Where do you think you would have stood, and what do you think the arguments are for both? Because it really comes down to an almost religiosity, and I think people just being tired of living like they're living. They don't want to live on these ships anymore, and you can understand that. So what did you think about that whole arc and this total conflict where they need everyone on board, figuratively speaking, in order to find Earth? What do you think about those conflicting goals?
I mean, it was interesting. I love having that sort of split between whatever's left of humanity. What is it at the end, like 40,000 or something? I love having that split between the sort of sect that wants to continue to go in for the religion or the prophecy end of things, and then the other sect that says, you know, we found an Earth-like place. What's the difference? Let's just settle here. You know, they find a place that's seemingly Earth-like in every way, and they start to settle. And first of all, I love the fact that Gaius goes in for the presidency, and then, you know, the whole thing with the, becoming president, even sort of flying in the face of the whole contingent who rigs the election and everything. And he still comes because they think it's so dangerous. So Madam President thinks it's so dangerous with Colonel Ty's help and everything. They think it's so dangerous for him to be president that they're going to rig the entire thing, and then they get found out. So Gaius gets his wish. He gets to be president anyway, and we see he's completely unfit for the role. And so, you know, humanity seems to be in a bad spot under Gaius. And then sort of the two, humanity being split in two as far as like what they want the end goal to be. Like, are they ready to just leave space and settle on this planet that's Earth-like, or do they go in to, continue to try to find Earth and be beholden to the religion that they were initially compelled to seek out, the prophecy and everything? But I could see wanting to also the notion, very important, the notion that even Adama thinks, like, after whatever it is, like a year and a half, that the Cylons, he believes that the Cylons kind of stopped pursuing them for whatever reason. Like, he thinks that threat has abated.
Right.
And I think that's really interesting that, so basically they're completely taken off guard because the Cylons basically, that terrorist sect set off that nuke. They blow up, I guess that's the luxury, they blow up Cloud9, I guess. And then as a result of that nuclear blast, that's how the Cylons find them, ironically, because they say they would have never found them there, because of the soup, or because they could never detect, whatever the atmosphere was like there. So the Cylons track them via that terrorist attack, and that's how we leave it. We leave it with the Cylons, sort of the Cylon army, amassing above the planet. And that small pocket of resistance, Anders is sick, but I guess, led by Starbuck saying like, all right, like, we got to fight. You know what I mean? We got to run for the hills basically. And we're going to put up whatever kind of resistance we can. And that's how it, the very compelling notion to end on, because you think it's not looking good for mankind at this point.
No,
it's just not.
No, not at all. And I do love how much Laura flirts with totalitarianism. She's not really truly democratic. I don't think any of them really are. And we talked about this a little bit in the last episode about Battlestar, but I feel like one of the most interesting things about the lore building in the TV series is how it often suggests that the society in which they come from is not that liberal. And I don't mean like big L, like Democrat. I mean, it seems like a somewhat illiberal society in some ways. Right. Again, we learned in the first season that they were like, books were banned, certain books where you couldn't read. And it's a really interesting thing. And so I don't think they have this truly American, like, let's say, democratic foundation, which was why I think the 9/11 parallels are so interesting, because you could say the same thing about some of the things that were being said and done post 9/11 as well. But I really dig that they get more into the granular stuff that makes the Cylons operate and what their goal might be. And I kind of wanted to ask you that, as someone who doesn't know what happens next. There are two questions I really wanted to ask you. And there are other things I want to explore as well. But in terms of this prognostication, let's say, I'm curious, who, if any other person, do you think is a Cylon? And what do you think will what do you think will end up happening as a result? I'm just curious where your mind is at right now.
It's really interesting. That's one of the main things you're thinking throughout the series as we get different Cylons revealed to us, and we see the whole arc with Chief, paranoid that he's a Cylon and everything. It's like, who else could be a Cylon, and which characters would pose the greatest danger for humanity if they were a Cylon? Super interesting. First of all, I have to say, the Madam President arc over the season was really, really wonderful, because I really thought that she was going to die. Seemed like the cancer was going to get the better of her. She was on her all but on her deathbed. And then she comes around. There's so much gray with the character. We know she's good. We know the relationship that's blossoming between her and Adama, that mutual respect and everything. But the fact that she orders Cain's assassination, she rigs an election, she outlaws abortion. You make great points. Like, she's a character who really, it's not all good. It's a little bit of her way or the highway. She sees that, I think her intentions are good, but she's going to do it by any means necessary, even if she has to be talked down the ledge by characters like Adama, which makes her a very interesting character. I mean, you think about the season, even Billy in the beginning of the season goes against her and says, I love you, but I can't go along with what you're doing here. When she breaks off with Adama and sort of takes a third of the fleet with her, like, it's a really interesting arc. She's got, from the beginning of the season, we know that she's got a finite time to live. So that's really interesting. I really can't say I know where it's going into season 3. It's really interesting for me. We know that the main characters, our head protagonists, are going to form up some sort of resistance, right? Who is it? It's Hilo, it's Chief, it's Starbuck, it's all the main players. So that's going to be interesting. But it seems like going into season 3, they're really up against, the fleet / humanity is really up against pretty overwhelming odds in coming in. Also completely blindsided because they really, as we said, we really thought they were out of the woods. I don't know really why they thought that, but I guess it was because the longevity of that period. They had never experienced a period of a year and a half of peace like that, or of not being, perpetually pursued by this relentless enemy.
Right.
So it's going to be really interesting, man. If I had to pick one character who I suspect is a Cylon at the time coming out, who's interesting to me? The Callie character. And I only say that because she was so... We know that she loves Chief. We know that, we know she's loyal and all that. We didn't get a lot of the character during this season, so we don't really know a lot about Callie. The only reason I question that is because I'm not sure of her significance, but that would be an interesting one for me, the Callie character. Besides that, I'm really not sure. I can't ask you to guess because you already know.
Yeah.
If any,
Yeah, it's always fun to just kind of see where people think things are going, and since you brought up, and we've been talking a lot about Laura, I also wanted to kind of press you on, what do you think about the kind of budding love of Adama and Rosalind? I really find some of their moments really cute and heartwarming, and love this budding romance that kind of builds between them this season.
It's cool. There's such a warmth between the two, and we know they may have slightly different approaches, slightly different personalities, but they both want the same thing. And I love, if you look back to the beginning or the middle of season 1, where it was like they were kind of saddled with this woman who was coming out of education, and she was going to be the president. She really wasn't appropriate for the role, and what Adama thought of her, and the lack of respect, that growing respect and admiration and that warmth. I think a lot of it has to do with the acting, both actors just bringing it, that chemistry as well, and wondering, is this just sort of an affection for a working relationship and an affection blooming from that, or is this a romance that's sort of brewing here? And I think you kind of get that a little bit. I think you sort of see that there's something going on beyond the professional level. I think there's some sort of romance brewing between the two, which makes sense. It totally makes sense. I love Almost in this. He really... He's got that like whispery, raspy, you almost want to see him as Batman type of approach.
Sure.
And then she's got that warmth too, and that sort of quirky nature and that personality. She's a little playful. And she's got a new lease on life, for being saved, not very gratefully, but being saved by Gaius and then having this second lease on life. So it is interesting. Those are two of the characters who I'm looking forward to seeing the most, especially coming into the season, not knowing if Adama was even going to live. I mean, we come into the season, he's critically wounded. So, how is that going to go? And then not only that, but the Ty character, I think he's really interesting. He had a really cool arc. I think they could have done a little more with him. I love the exposition with the whole Cain thing where he's with the other XO and he's sort of drawing that out of the other XO and everything. I love the arc where he's not just being sort of an obstacle, and he's not just sort of being pig-headed. He helps Chief secure the tech that he needs for the Phantom, the Phantom Fighter, the Phantom Viper, the Blackbird. That was kind of cool. So we see Ty get a little more involved, and we also see him double down on his loyalty to Adama, which I always think is really right to the very end of the season, which I think is really touching too. And how he really, for as good as he is as an officer, he really wasn't capable of doing what Adama did when Adama could have been on his deathbed over the throes of the first few episodes of the season. So knowing really that he's a good complement to Adama, but he's no Adama.
Yeah, we see him struggle a lot with leadership and going and visiting Adama bedside, kind of lamenting the situations he finds himself in. He's obviously in a very toxic relationship with his wife, and I think Ellen Ty is a really interesting character too. And so it is fascinating to kind of watch him kind of get more ingratiated, and you kind of root for him in a way because you know that he's not well liked. It is funny watching that. I think it's the first episode of the season where it's like flashbacks of them, and they're supposed to be like younger, but it looks so ridiculous, like how they tried to make them look younger, you know. And it's almost
that was kind of crazy.
It was like comical, like laugh out loud funny, that stuff. But a few other things I wanted to ask you, Dave, before we wrap up, and I can throw it to you if there's anything else you want to talk about. One of my favorite scenes in the whole show is in the second season, and we haven't brought it up yet, which is when they use the Arrow of Apollo. And I love this entire sequence of them following the scripture and seeing the places on Kobol that are discussed, and that it requires people to die, and they're in like the meadow where everyone fled, and they're walking all along the trails, and it's very mystical, and it gets a giddy inside. It's really exciting. But when they put the arrow into the bow and they realize that they're standing on Earth, and the map to Earth is above them, and it's the stars so it's literally how we see the stars from our perspective. And they have to figure that out. That's where Earth is. And they do that by figuring out one of the nebulas that they recognize. But I love that they finally work in like, oh, the 12 colonies are named after the original names of these constellations that people saw on Earth. And here is the map. I think it is a very stunningly cool scene. I'm curious if you had any thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I forgot all about that, to be honest with you. Yeah, that was cool because it really gives it a grounded time and place in our universe. You know, it was one of those things where it almost seemed hokey going into it. It was like they're going to get this relic and they're beholden to this monotheistic philosophy, and they're it's almost like this Greek god thing. It almost seems ancient and almost seems kind of this antiquated belief system. But then when it plays into, this whole thing drives home the reality. Even them going after the relic, that whole thing seemed like, all right, all of a sudden there's this Indiana Jones type subplot. I don't know exactly what's going on here. It was all kind of shocking and confusing, but that grounded it. That was a whole thing, and the thing was like, okay, now this kind of grounds it in is this past, present, or future? It almost gives it that Star Wars-esque thing of like, when is this taking place in like a modern day contemporary human timeline and place? That's for me what I got out of it. I was like, wow, how is this going to tie in? And knowing that there's 40 episodes left, there's plenty of time to explain it, which is interesting. So I mean, I think, yeah, for me it was a really cool payoff, I think, in the whole thing, because I wasn't really thrilled with that whole thing and learning what the humans, what the religions and the prophecy and the
that's so interesting. I think that shit's awesome. That's like some of the best stuff. You like that? Well, because it does. You don't usually see. I always try to convince people to watch Battlestar, and maybe I'm not doing it justice by describing it such like this, but I'm like, it's the religious aspect of it and the philosophical and spiritual aspect of the show that makes it so unique, because you do not see that in science fiction. It's just, that's something maybe like you see, like this reminds me a little bit of Dune and some other stuff where it just seems so gritty and real and almost overboard from even our own society. I mean, another example is when we learned that Adar was killing teachers, right? Like we learned that Laura was basically making deals with the teachers union, who were basically looked at as terrorists, and they were killed. I mean, this is a different society than the one we're used to. It's like
get that.
And I do think that Laura is a totalitarian in a way. And it's not necessarily that it's bad, because I don't know what we would do in this situation. That's why it's so fascinating to think about the philosophical questions of abortion, for instance. Like, I am pro-choice, but in that situation, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Like, that seems to be actually incredibly stupid. I think that and that's what it's so interesting when Gaius comes out and almost seems to defend the president before stabbing her in the back, like one moment later, by announcing he's running for president.
Yeah.
He basically comes out and says, like, times have changed. We have to look at things differently. And it's true. And so, like, yeah, you are pro-choice under the most ideal circumstances, but how dare we like try to snuff out a human life right now? Are you crazy?
Right.
And
You could be totally sympathetic to
right.
that
And
in that circumstance.
and so I just think like it's fun to kind of look at it through our own societal relativistic lens and compare and contrast. And of course, we've talked a lot about 9/11, but just about the general dichotomy between their world and ours and how it all goes through. And we see a few of these things and the different ways it vacillates. For instance, I really like the episode that's about the ex-military guy, Phelan, and the black market that he runs.
Oh, it's great.
And how, it's on a ship called the Prometheus and all of this and how much power that people have economically and how the in a perfect situation, it's doubtful that the government would let something like this happen, but they realize that they need this to lubricate the wheels of commerce and get things done. And they just go and kill the leader. And everyone, I love when Lee kills Phelan because no one cares.
No.
And I love when he's like, it's done. That's what he says. Like, he's like, it's done. And everyone is kind of like relieved that it's over and they can just do their business, but they don't have to have sex children. They have children for sex slaves. Like,
they're trafficking kids.
Right. And those are things that are obviously never okay. But you look at something like Lee is getting involved in with a prostitute. It's like, well,
yeah,
this seems like it was legal back in their society, but also times have changed. You have to kind of look at things a little bit differently. So that's why when you see things like torture, slavery, rape, all those things, that's never okay. But when you see things like switching from pro-choice to pro-life, like Laura is kind of forced to, or seeing Doc Cottle struggle with the situation he's put in with the baby, where they're hiding the baby and they fake the death and they make that Sharon go crazy and all that. But you kind of understand in a normal circumstance that would be unthinkable. But the Cylons want that kid, so it's best for them to think that kid is dead.
Absolutely.
And so you understand when you have like prostitutes and military guys and merchants and scumbags and some criminals and it's just kind of the way it goes. And
absolutely. Dude. The black market, right? Like treating that like this is an inevitability. That was another thing that subverted my expectations. It was like, and another point for the character of Rosalind, where it's like she wanted to shut down the black market, and the outcome was, no, the black market is a necessary evil. It's always going to exist. It's inevitable. The child trafficking was a bridge too far, and we had to take care of that. But people are going to need medicine. They're going to want booze. They're going to want tobacco. Prostitution was also considered in that whole thing. They're going to want, the exotic things like fresh fruit. There's no way to shut that down. It's always going to exist. So we might as well let it exist and develop whatever parameters we have to, evolve it. But, that's another thing. It's like in this modern era, we can't shut this down. And that was another thing for Lee's character, like how strong he is, what a great, he was a really interesting character, the Apollo character for me, because he went from being, we talked about this in season 1, seeming like a flyboy, like a jock. We know he's kind of saddled with, being the commander's son and having to live under that shadow, but we didn't get a lot from him, but he really blossomed into a strong character in season 2. By the time he's promoted to major and then he's promoted to commander at the end of the series, like, it's like that character's really come full turn. He got comfortable in his own skin. He realized his value wasn't in being like Starbuck. It wasn't going to be in like bucking the system or being a maverick or being rebellious or flying in the face of his superiors. It was going to be his leadership skills and how instrumental he was going to be into their survival. So he really grew for me as a character. And also, being, seeing the whole thing with the prostitute, seeing the whole thing of like him having gray areas too. His humanity was on full display as well, just like every other character. But I really liked his arc over the season, the black market thing, how useful he was and how courageous he was and just tracking that guy down and pursuing that whole thing to its end. And awesome. Just awesome. One of my favorite characters coming out of season 2.
I noticed that in our discussions over text that you seem to have taken to him, which is cool. And I like the prostitute thing, especially because we get a lot of exposition about his past and his regrets in his own love life. And I thought that was pretty neat. It just gives that character a little more texture. We've kind of gotten that texture about Starbuck because of her love for Lee's deceased brother. So it's kind of cool to see the other side of the coin as well.
Yeah.
And I think the only other thing that I just wanted to bring up really quick is I also really dug the episode about Saisha Abinell, the kind of conspiracy theorist that tries to take over the bar and get
good.
Because you can kind of understand, like, oh well, why are we collaborating with the Cylons? How can we trust that this Sharon model is not going to activate? And I don't know, like it's unclear to me. I'd have to go back and watch like what they know, like what the fleet knows about who killed or tried to kill Adama and all of that. So I just thought that was a neat episode as well. And again, just dealing with all these social issues, torture, abortion, religion, electioneering. And I mean, again, Laura is been flirting with fascism the entire time and tries to manipulate the election. And the military's in on this. So it's cool to see that they're kind of dirty. They're not playing by the rules, but you can't really play by the rules I think they've kind of embraced as people that playing by the rules hasn't actually gotten them this far. It was Starbuck that like disappeared and went to Caprica on her own. Remember, like to get the arrow, she stole the Raider.
Sure.
And all of the rest. So there's a lot of examples of them bucking the trend, or when there's like a little bit of a civil war between Lee and his father. So there's a lot to say here. Is there anything, Dagan, that we didn't touch on that you wanted to talk about?
No, that episode at the bar, that sacrifice episode, was really wonderful. First of all, the death of Billy. That was sad.
Yeah,
it
is sad.
Go.
Yeah.
And President sort of usher in a new assistant. Oh, I forget that character's name. But, Lee almost dying at the hands of Starbuck, accidentally friendly fire, right?
Tori's the character, by the way.
Okay, Tori's the new assistant.
Right.
Yeah,
like
she's great.
Indian girl.
She's kind of whisked in right away, and you're like, who is this? But then you remember Billy got killed.
Right.
That whole thing in the bar, the love triangle between Billy and Dee and Lee, and Lee, a call to action for Lee, and really, you talk about how morose the series could be, the violence, the terrorist attacks, the people dying, the bloodletting. It always seems like somebody's bleeding out in one of the episodes. You got betrayal, dead babies, like it gets really heavy. But in this episode, you're really compelled to think, wow, are they going to kill off Lee after all this? Are they going to, let this character die? Super crazy episode. But again, you could almost, part of you goes out, your sympathy goes out to the terrorists or the people hijacking or holding up that bar, because that woman's husband was killed by a Cylon. So it was revenge, so it's like the things that people are compelled to do in the name of love or revenge. And just the fact it smacks of realism to me for those human conflicts to still exist, even in the face of a larger enemy or a common enemy, for people to still be infighting and disagreeing, and those conflicts to be brewing even in the face of this war with this, deadly enemy, is really interesting. And I think they really did a great job in writing this season. A lot of subverting of expectations, a lot of really thoughtful stuff. Everything seems connected. Even the fun one-off stories are connected in some way to the larger picture. And just great character building, man. Really, really fun characters. I really hope it keeps going in an awesome direction. And you know what? They seem to have a very Game of Thrones-esque disregard for their characters. Like anybody, they definitely set the tone of any character could go in any time. And I got to say, that's one of the big compelling points for me to keep going, is like, who are they going to kill off? Who are they going to have the audacity or the courage to let go next? It's scary. I'm a little nervous about it, to be honest with you.
And let me ask you this. What are your questions about the Cylons? What do you need to know about them? Do you want to see their home planet? Do you want to see more of their ships or anything like that?
Seeing their home planet would be pretty compelling. I think that would be really cool. Yeah, and I just want to see what their end game is. I just want to see why they're so bloodthirsty for human lives, and why they feel so compelled to destroy humanity. And also, in the same breath, could they be... There's the whisperings. There's the faint whisperings that maybe they could be talked out of that or change their views. And seeing if that becomes part of the Seeing if that becomes part of their protocol. Maybe even with, humanity being fed up, like up to their gills and running, and maybe, humanity kind of turns and on a more Cain-like approach and starts hunting and starts fighting and is much more brutal in their approach, while the Cylons sort of take a knee and are like, all right, do we need to be, is this conflict necessary? It would be kind of cool to see it flip a little bit and see what that spells out.
Sure.
That could be interesting.
I agree. And I mean, that brings up the whole, I assume Cain was named for Cain and Abel. I always kind of assumed that was the reference. And, like one brother killing the other brother, one side doing things the different way than the other one is.
Sure.
I feel like that was the reference. And it is interesting because you're going to learn a lot more about the Cylons. And I find what's most fascinating about them is their technology and all of that and the way they interact with things. And I think not just to foreshadow things, that you're also going to learn about what they were up to in between the original war and when they attacked again. And that's where shit gets really fun, like, to me. And that's why I reject kind of these things where it's like season 3 and season 4 are like these big step ups. I'm not so sure about that. Not if you're, I'll rejudge it now. It's probably been 10 years since I've seen the last season. So I'm excited to get into all this thing, but it's been fun. I know it's time consuming, but I'm glad that you're giving it a chance, and I hope you are enjoying it. I suspect you will continue to, but we'll see. We'll do another episode in a month or so, and we'll revisit season 3 this time.
It's good stuff. And we're watching, I should note for you guys out there, we're watching it, or I'm watching it on Peacock, on the Peacock network. But I think it's available. You have to pay for it on YouTube. I'm not sure where else.
Yeah, it was on Netflix.
Pretty cool.
It was on Netflix for many years. And then I think when Peacock or maybe it was a Prime, and then when Peacock came, obviously NBC owns it, so they took it. And apparently there's a director's cut of the episode Pegasus, which I have never seen and Peacock doesn't have. And apparently there's also a director's cut of Razor, which I have also never seen. And apparently Pegasus does not, or I'm sorry, apparently Peacock does not have those episodes. So we'll have to look into that. But I think actually, I don't know what we're going to do next because we have to figure it out. I'm pretty sure Razor came out after season 3. Okay. I'm going to have to look at this, but I think it's, let me see, Battlestar sequential viewing, because I think, Battlestar Galactica viewing order. So miniseries season 1, season 2. And then, people suggest Razor, although the dialogue at the very end. So I think maybe what we'll do is we'll watch season 3 next and then do Razor, because even though Razor does take place there it does apparently spoil a little bit of season 4. So,
really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting to note.
So
we got to watch out for that.
Yeah, and then it gets all crazy at the end of like season 4. Like some of those episodes I think are like 2 or 3 hours long. So there's a lot to get into. I'm excited about it. So we're doing Metal Gear Solid soon. I think we'll probably throw another movie in there, and then we'll probably get back to Battlestar. So Dig, I appreciate you taking the time today to record. Super fun. You know what? I was just reading and I didn't realize I forgot to mention that the Cylons, sort of Gaius, at the very end of season 2, Gaius sort of brokers a peace with the Cylons, and the Cylons say, like, look, if you guys don't fight back or attack, there'll be no bloodshed. And in the same breath, that's when Starbuck is like, we're gonna fight back. Right. Yeah, exactly. So that's that's a great note to end it on. Yeah, it's awesome because Gaius is a puppet government. And so he's being manipulated by them. And also, let's not forget that another interesting hanging thread is that Rosalind knows subconsciously that she saw Gaius with 6 on Caprica. And that's right. So there's that whole thing too, where she is like subconsciously aware that she knows Gaius is responsible for something because she saw him working with the Cylons. Right. And Adama is like, that may be true, but you have no proof of it. Oh man, that's good shit. I forgot about that. Yeah, absolutely. It's a great way to end. It's not, and you know what? It's a great cliffhanger from 2 into 3. We had the great cliffhanger from 1 into 2. This is more of a gentle cliffhanger, but I like it just as much as Adama being shot at the end of season 1. You know, it's strong stuff because you really
I don't see any way of the humans getting out of this. They're fighting a completely superior fighting force. They're severely outnumbered, right? So it's going to be interesting, man. I'm looking forward to doing this next one.
Cool, man. Well, we'll do it in the coming weeks. Stig, let's wrap up as we always do with a dad joke.
All right, my friend Kyle. Did you know I once got fired from a canned juice company? Yeah, I totally couldn't concentrate.
It's pretty good. I like that one.
You like that one?
Yeah, that's not bad.
All right.
That's not a bad one.
All right.
Dig. Well, good to see your face and good to see all of you out there as well. Thank you for your love, kindness, and support, whether on free feeds or on Patreon at patreon.com/laststandmedia. We'll see you next time for more KnockBack. Until then, goodbye. KnockBack, a retro and nostalgia podcast, is a product and trademark of Last Stand Media and Collins Last Stand LLC, and is recorded from Central Virginia and the Philadelphia suburbs, USA. The show was conceived by and is produced by me, Colin Moriarty. My co-host is Dagan Moriarty. KnockBack's executive producer is Dustin Furman, and the show is edited by associate producer Ben Smith. Stan's theme music is by Ramon Narvaez. As you know, all of Last Stand Media's shows, including KnockBack, are fan-funded on Patreon at patreon.com/laststandmedia. The following names are at the producer support level or higher on Patreon, and we're grateful for your kindness and generosity.